So first of all, I just want to start off again by saying thank you to Sheila and for the other members of the committee for inviting me today to talk about ringforts. And also, as Sheila said, a big thanks to the Heritage Council and the heritage officers within the County Council who organise Heritage Week every year. And I think every year it gets bigger. And we're really spoilt for choice, really, with the amount of events that are happening within this week. And I'd like to say that I don't think I've ever spoken in such a picturesque or striking place. So it's a real pleasure to be here. So today I'm just going to talk about ringforts, how and when they were built, and describe some of the typical finds found associated with them during excavation work or surveying. A lot of this is fairly general, as they're not often excavated. So in this country, the policy is usually not to excavate things. It's always the position of last resort. And the only time they're usually excavated, you would have a ringfort excavation, is during a large infrastructure job, like motorways, or the recent motorway network that's been done, and pipelines, or very large housing estates where you can't really jiggle the buildings around. I've only worked on 3 ringforts myself, one on the South Link, just outside Ballincollig, and another one on Watergrass Hill on the Dublin motorway, and then a third one in Carrigaline where they were going to try and expand the pharmaceutical place. So it's those sort of times that ringforts will actually be excavated. And so the reason I'm talking today here is because we're by a ringfort. And that's the title of the talk, and that's what I'm going to stick to. But as I'll say at the end, things have changed since then, and members of the staff of UCC have been down and had a look at this, and just from a very cursory look at it, I would agree that it probably isn't a ringfort. But I'll say at the end what I think it probably could be and what Professor O'Brien thinks it is. So this site is listed on the RMP, which is the Record of Monuments and Places, or the SMR, which is the Sites and Monuments Register. And we're very lucky in this country that every monument, every recorded monument is listed in one place on the National Inventory of the Archaeological Heritage. And this is available to everyone to access and to look at, mainly through 2 websites. There's archaeology.ie and heritagemaps.ie. And I'd urge everyone to look at those. If you're interested in your locality, you can search on the map, and then you can get every detail that's known about that locality, every particular monument recorded, and you can also flick through aerial maps, aerial photographs, satellite photographs, and you can see back to the previous editions of the Ordnance Survey map. So you had the big surveys in the 1940s for the 3rd edition, in the 1900 for the 2nd edition, and the very first edition in about 1840. And Ireland was actually the first country that the Ordnance Survey surveyed in such a detail at 6 inches to the mile. And from Ireland, they actually learned a lot, and they went on to survey countries like India. So this monument is listed on the RMP as CO150-037, and 150 refers to the 6-inch map. So you're on the 150th 6-inch map of the country, which starts way up. Number 1 is up in northwest Donegal. And it's described, they say, ringfort on east-facing slope, north of Baltimore, local tradition of lists, area completely inaccessible owing to overgrowth. So this was in July 1985. And I've just been told that OPW came out again around the turn of the millennium to try and reassess the site. And again, it was completely overgrown. And then Sheila's been telling me that it's only in the last few months, since May, that this amount of clearing work has been going on here. And so it's a real testament to the local community group in Baltimore that such an interesting site has been made accessible. Because it's a big problem with lots of sites is the accessibility of them. So, a bit of a spoiler alert, this is not a typical ringfort, but as I say, I'll talk about that at the end. So a ringfort then is the most common field monument in the country. There's over 3,500, 3,700 recorded in County Cork, and over 45,000 in the island altogether. And this could be, I mean, it is a bit too easy sometimes to classify monuments, as this has happened with this, but it's just a general classification, so it just means a circular earthwork anyway. So this includes many sites which have recorded by tradition, like this one. This is known as the list field, apparently by people. So that's how this one got recorded, even though it wasn't visited. It's not shown on the Ordnance Survey map as such. And other ring forts are recorded because they're shown on the older maps. If you look back through the older maps, you'll often see a ring fort marked in 1840, which is no longer extant, is no longer visible, and then is not shown on later mapping. And crop marks will often also reveal ring forts. You can see those, especially in times of sort of very, very dry weather, like the summer we had 3 years ago. Or I think back in 1976, again, when there was a very, very dry summer. And you tend to get features showing up very, very strongly in extra dry summers. If you have a ditch which is has a deeper topsoil in it, then that holds moisture, and it just means the grass stays slightly greener on top. And if you send the drone up at the right time, or you're in a light aircraft, these things will suddenly jump out at you from the landscape. So that's what we call by crop marks aerial photography. It's a very, very important tool of archaeology as well. And probably, I mean, most of you would have been to Newgrange, and if you think in the summer 3 years ago, Newgrange is a very, very studied site. Lots known about it. But in that summer, I forget how many new sites were found just around Newgrange at the bend of the Boyne. So when I visit farmers or I'm ahead of a development, then I'm often told, oh, that ring fort's gone. But these monuments, they survive, even though you can't actually see them as a surface trace. They'll be still surviving under the ground. I mean, or just very often as well, you get a slight kink in the road. Or, a boreen turns a right angle, and that can sometimes be the sign that it's gone round a monument that was there originally and has now gone. I mean, just as an example, I was doing a forestry job where they were going to plant, and I was asked to go and field walk. And there was a boreen with a slight little rounded kink at the end of the boreen. And so I walked down there. This land had been neglected for a good few years, so it's very overgrown. But you could see that as I walked down the boreen, the sides of the lane were lined with stone walls. And as I got to this little kink, suddenly they had changed to earthen banks, and the actual laneway became waterlogged. And so what had actually happened was the boreen had gone around a ring fort. And the rest of the ring fort had actually been levelled, but that had long gone before the first edition map in 1840. And again, I talked to the farmer, and he had no idea about this. But he said his parents had always told him not to hang around in that field because it was and it was known as the fairy field, and he was warned to keep away from there. So this folk tradition, this memory, had gone back at least sort of 200 years. So most of you are farmers will have one either on your own land or possibly on neighbours' land, or at least you'll know in the area where they all are. And on the whole, they've been well respected and preserved through the generations. And many of them have been sort of repurposed in later years. So a very common feature of ring forts is that they have been reused later as a burial ground, especially children's burial grounds, which, they weren't, by the church, they couldn't really be buried in holy grounds. So usually a corner of a field, some special place was put aside for the children's burial ground. And quite often a ring fort was chosen because that was somewhere that they knew they could safely bury their children and they wouldn't be disturbed. At other times, they can be also used as gardens, the little handy places to have a garden. And you'll often go into a ring fort and see lazy beds, potato ridges inside. And the soil would often be very sort of deep and productive as well. So the first question to ask is what is a ring fort? So, the basic answer is they were the enclosed farmsteads found in this country. So all of you were farmers, that's where you would have been living. You were living within a ring fort. And they date mainly from the 5th to the 9th centuries AD. So this is it's one of those times in Irish sort of history and prehistory when the economy seems to have been booming, the population expanding. And this is around, the 5th century is when Christianity was first coming into the country. And you have one of the earliest sort of Christian sites out on Cape Clear. And some of them, there's evidence that they were actually used right up until the 17th or the 16th century. And it's very sort of noticeable if you visit some ring forts, they can be in this sort of condition where they look very eroded, they look old. And then there are plenty of ring forts which you go to and you would swear, they hadn't been abandoned more than, 100 or 200 years before, because the banks are still sharp and you can even see the fosse, the ditch going around the outside. They can be still visible, and you can quite clearly see that they must have been inhabited and used until, relatively recently. So starting around 1500 years ago. And just to put that in a little bit of context, which I always like to do, farming first came to Ireland around 4000 BC. So by the time these ring forts were being built, farming had been here for about 4,500 years. The first traces of people in the country then go back to about 8000 BC. That's the first sort of contemporary sites we have. There's places like sort of Mount Sandal up in the north, and other sites on the Blackwater Valley, dating back to the Mesolithic, the time when people were hunter-gatherers. And then just recently, there's been very exciting work done where animal bones that have been found in caves. There were some reindeer bones found in a cave on the Blackwater Valley near Lismore, and these were re-looked at. They were dated back to about 33,000 years ago, about 31,000 BC. The height of the last ice age, or even just before the height. And under high-powered microscopes, they noticed that some of these bones had cut marks on them, which indicates that people were there. There was no actual evidence of the people, but you can see the bones with the cut marks on there. So and there were reindeer. So I mean, you can imagine Ireland at that time was like northern Canada, a tundra, open tundra with reindeer and other sort of Arctic wildlife, bears and things like that. So you find ring forts throughout the country. They're one of those. I suppose there are not that many monuments which you find in every part of the country, and there doesn't seem to be huge regional variations either. Usually, you'll have different. With the megalithic tombs, you'll have different regional styles or designs. But the ring fort seems to be the basic farming community structure throughout the country. They're very dense in some places. There's a slight reduction in numbers in Donegal, in West Ulster, and surprisingly then in Leinster as well. And even though that's where some of the best land is these days, they think maybe sort of that back at this time, before the land was drained, before the rivers were brought under a bit of control, then these lands would have been too wet and too heavily covered with trees to make it easy to farm them. So they consist, as you can see here, with a circular bank and a ditch on the outside, enclosing an area which is typically 20 to 40 metres in diameter. So they're fairly large, and as I said, this is very small in comparison. The upcast soil from the ditch would have been used to build the banks, and some of these ditches, the one I dug near in Carrigaline, we were 3 metres down. They were very, very substantial. And there's usually only one entrance. There'll be one gap with a corresponding causeway then over the surrounding ditch. And there's one story which I remember reading in a book that there's records that there used to be wandering sort of gangs of men who would actually make their living by constructing ring forts. It's one of the stories told about them. And that they would actually do the manual labour, a lot of it, and then they would get paid in the amount of cattle that could be contained within that ring fort. That would be their payments at the end. So that they're known in Irish as rath or liss, And as you know, these are very common elements within the townland names. And so this is a handy tool really for having an idea how far back, how old the names for townlands are. Now this, as you would look at it now, is a simple what we call a univalent one. It has just one bank and one ditch. But we also find bi and trivalent, where you would have a circle of either 2 banks and 2 ditches, or even in very rare cases you'd have three banks, 3 ditches, and they would be sort of the size of them would reduce as the further out you went. So the outer ring could actually be even sort of quite a token bank with a token ditch around it. And this seems very much to be, we're assuming this is very much a reflection of sort of wealth, of status, of hierarchy. So the more dominant families within the community would have the larger one, and they'll often be found with a sort of a collection of smaller ones around them. You know, as I was saying, this was a time when wealth was measured in cattle. That was sort of the symbol of your wealth. This is a time when it was a pre-money phase. The rest of Europe, you had the Romans, and they had introduced money within the empire, but in Ireland that hadn't reached here yet. And then in England you had the later Saxon money systems as well, but in Ireland money didn't really come in until the Viking times and the Normans. So important other examples. I mean, this is a lovely one, but important examples of ringforts. We have Gorans near Aherla, which Professor O'Brien, who I'll be talking about later, has led well, it was excavated earlier, but he's revisited the site. This is a very large trivalent fort on the hills overlooking Aherla, Ringfort, and is associated with the Owenacta, the ancient tribe of Munster, and also with the family of St. Finbar. Another very, very interesting example, which is, I'd urge anyone to visit really, is Cahavaglia, just to the west of Copine. And this is a lovely, I think it's a bivalent ringfort. It has a very substantial inner ditch and inner bank. And entrance is made not through an open gap in the bank, but it's through a stone-lined tunnel. So it has a built-up passageway with large slab stones across the top. And as I say, that's a national monument, so it's open to anyone to visit. And another very good example is Frahans, which is just to the north of Roscarbery on the Rena-Screener Road, just off the Rena-Screener Road. And again, this is a very, very large, well-preserved one. And it's open access to anyone to go there. And this is one of those that I think, you know, it looks like there's been more recent upkeep of it. It's been used in more recent times. So one important variation in the ringfort design are the ones that are built out of stone. And they of course, are found in areas which are especially sort of rich in stone and where the soil isn't so easy to find. So they're mostly along the western seaboard. These are known as cashels or cahers. So again, another important part of the townland names. The best known example, which a few people have already mentioned to me, is Knockdrum outside Castle Townsend. Again, which is open to, it's a national monument and it has a nice pathway up to it, easy to visit. And these, again, they tend to be more, the cashels or the cahers are more up the western seaboard with a significant sort of clustering in the Burren. Now their typical location is also of sort of interest, and again, which I'll be talking about at the end, this isn't the typical location. They're usually found near the top of a slope of sort of good, dry, fertile soil. You would very, very rarely find one on either at the bottom of a slope or right on top. You have the idea of the big Iron Age, Bronze Age hill forts, which were built on top of hills to dominate an area. But these are always just off the brow of a hill. I mean, probably because of the weather. You want to have that little bit more shelter. And that's nearly always where you find them. And the other interesting thing about their location is the intervisibility. There always seems to be other ones in the surroundings. So it's very much this idea of sort of a visual territory, where from one ring fort you can always see quite a few others. And it's something that's very much, coming from England, where the rural settlement is very, very different. I was always struck by how the old farmhouses here are always, they're hardly ever in clusters like they would be in England, in little hamlets, but they're always scattered through the countryside, but they're always within view of each other. You would never, very rarely have an old farmhouse actually on its own. So they'll always have a view over and sort of looking out for each other. Another typical sort of variation on the ringfort theme is the crannog, which is a lake dwelling. In other countries they're called lake dwellings, but they are roughly contemporary with ring forts, this same time in the later first millennium. They're constructed in lakes where the water is shallow by driving big pilings of timber, a circle of timber posts into the soft lake bed, and then internally they would have piled up rock and brushwood, earth, anything like that, until they could raise the internal area of the crannog above the high water mark. There's only one crannog recorded in County Cork, and that's on Loch Alua between Inchigeelagh and Ballingeary. You can see, if you're driving to Gougon from Inchigeelagh, you can see the crannog very clearly in the lake. You can just see a sort of a big sally tree growing right in the middle of the lake. And I've been out there on kayaks, and you can still see the ring of pilings around it. There are a few others suspected. There's another one at Lepp, so even nearer to here at Loch Corran, where you can see in the centre of the lake, you can see reeds growing, which indicates that the lake bed is slightly higher, and they think there could well be one there. And then a further one could even be at St Finbarr's Oratory out at Gougon, where they think the little island where you walk out on the causeway, that could have actually been originally partially man-made anyway. And crannogs, again, they don't seem to have been used for daily living. They seem more to have been, again, a little bit more high status, places of refuge, and they seem to be quite often associated with craft work, with metal work, and important stuff like sort of jewellery making, where there's something of a little bit more of above the normal value. And the vast majority of these are found north of the Shannon, especially up in the Drumlin Belt in the Midlands there. Especially in Mayo, I mean, there nearly every little lake has a crannog in it. So in that area, they probably, very well did replace people would be living there like they would have been living in a ring fort down here. So the other thing that always has to be mentioned in line with ring forts are souterrains. It comes from the French word souterre, meaning under the ground. And I'm sure everyone here has probably either seen one or heard of one. They're often called caves or tunnels, and they'll be marked on some of the older maps. And they were chambers dug into the ground, connected by very narrow creepways. Usually stone lined, occasionally they're just earth cut. And there were two ways of making them, either by actually burrowing down and almost like a miner, sort of excavating the tunnels and then the chambers. Or in other places, they actually cut an open passageway into the ground. So a trench, they would open up a large trench. They would dig the chambers as well. And then they would build dry stone walls on either side and then roof them with large slabs and then backfill afterwards. These can often be very, very elaborate, so there can be up to 4 or 5 chambers. And the actual creepways, the tunnels can be, some of them are almost up to 80 metres in length. So very, very substantial monuments. And their actual function, again, is a little bit of a mystery. So, they quite obviously would have been used as refuge. because they're so hard to access. But then other ideas are that they were used for storing dairy produce. If you dig down, the climate, the temperature and the humidity would have been stable and you could store things down there. But this seems a very, very sort of elaborate length to go to just for cold storage, where you could have just dug an ordinary sort of pit, a simple pit. So I think probably refuge is an important element of them. And it's from these souterrains that we get the idea of the fairy forts, I think. You would have an opening which people could see, and originally they think they were actually hidden. So if the ringfort or the community came under attack, then people could just sort of hide down there very quickly. Any attackers would probably have to disperse quite quickly, and then you could come up again when it was safe. But so often they're known about, there'll be rumours of them. Today they're often found when farmers get a bigger machine. They'll have been driving over a field, for years. They get a bigger machine, have a bigger bale of silage on the back, and then suddenly the back wheel goes through the roof of a chamber or a creepway. And that's the most common way they're found these days. And they're usually associated with ring forts, but they're also associated with early Christian sites and early sort of settlements, open settlements. And they can quite often be found just in the middle of nowhere, just in isolation. I just recently recorded one near my home place where the tractor had gone through the roof, and it was on a sloping field halfway up a mountain, and there was no other sort of early medieval monument for at least a mile around. So you just wouldn't expect to find one there. So this is where the superstition comes from, that it was the home of the little people, of the fairy folk, or the opening to the underworld. And so people had a general superstition about fairy forts and not to interfere or to leave them alone. And I was just remembering on the way up that my own neighbour, his mother would never let the grandchildren walk further along the road than the ring fort, but she said it was bad luck for them to pass the ring fort. And you hear many sort of stories like that. Now, the ring forts were also contemporary with early Christian enclosures and monasteries, which I won't go into today. But the early Christian sites, they have the same sort of, I suppose you call it morphology, the concentric circles, though on a much larger scale. So you have the early Christian sites of Rosscarbery, which would have been a very important seat of learning at this time, and I think Abbeystreury in Skibbereen as well. So ring forts are unique to Ireland. They're not found at this time in any other place in Europe, which makes them quite special. And they belong to the early medieval period, but they come out of the time called the Iron Age, which to archaeologists is a little bit of a dark period, dark ages, when there's very, very little known. There's not so many monuments recorded. You get few finds from that time. It's a little bit of an empty time, and suddenly you have this great flourishing of the early medieval period, starting in about the 5th century. So some of the ring forts have evidence of earlier Iron Age, not of occupation. There's no structures found, but you might find Iron Age stray objects within the context within the ring fort. Now they're very much seen as the start of a great economic boom, which happened in Ireland as the rest of Europe was sort of going into what they called their Dark Ages, with the withdrawal of the Romans in 410. If you remember, the emperor in Rome issued a command for the last legions to be withdrawn from Britain. They'd come under considerable pressure from raiders. There had been the Saxons in the east, the Picts to the north, and the Irish to the west. So the Irish were putting a lot of pressure on the Roman Empire and defending their way of life. And this wasn't all sort of military. I think a lot of it was trade as well. So the Romans would have traded with the Irish. Ireland was well known for its hides, for its leathers, which they had in large numbers, and I think also their hunting dogs, which were held in great value by the inhabitants of England at the time. and also for slaves, unfortunately, because this is a slave-owning period, not only within the Roman Empire, but in Ireland as well. And if you remember, that's how Patrick first comes to Ireland. He's actually kidnapped by Irish slavers in Lancashire and brought over. So the Roman Empire sort of stimulated trade and the spread of new ideas throughout Europe, and these came to Ireland. You had, especially not just Christianity, which obviously came from the continent, but you'd have been in contact with the continent here. You'd have had boats going out to Brittany, to France, rather than across to the UK. And that's the way, it seems to be the way that the Christianity came in. But there was also a great sort of spread of new technology as well. So you had improvements in agriculture happening at this time. You had new tools, you had better, stronger ploughs, which allowed sort of greater areas to be cultivated. I think the rotary quern was improved at this time. You had new breeds of cattle and of sheep. And you had sort of new plants were encouraged that farmers were growing. So you had oats and rye were grown sort of on much larger scales than they had before. And you also had things like the horizontal watermill, which were brought in. It's assumed that one possible reason for their development is as a place of ringforts, is as a place to secure your agricultural produce. So you would have wanted to keep your seed grain secure, your animals secure for the year after, for the new season. And especially the old idea is that this is somewhere that you could bring in times of trouble, you could bring your cattle. And you have to remember at this time, wolves were still endemic, so they would be at danger at night. You know, the last wolf, I think, was only killed in Kilmallock in the 1700s or the 1600s. And also at this time, the open fields were, the fields were open. So you didn't really have enclosed fields. The only place you would have had enclosed fields would have been within the immediate surrounds of a ringfort, where you'd have done your growing of your cereals and your other crops. And the rest of it would have been open pasture. And you'd have probably had the, parts of the family, usually the young lads or the girls going out with the cattle and guarding them as they wandered around grazing. And you would have had to bring them in maybe then for safety or for milking. And this is also a time, as we know from the old sagas, when cattle raiding was still endemic. So you have the great sort of sagas like the Cattle Raider Cooley, which tells of, big expeditions to steal the neighbours' cattle. And this was probably going on in a small scale in many areas as well. So there were probably a response to an increased population, because all this new technology, the new cereals, were actually led to a great expansion in population. And you had a growth of a more structured society. It was sort of based on kinship and the small sort of kingship groups, minor kingships. So it was a very sort of small regional structure, but quite structured in its own right. And you can see this in the many examples of the law tracts we have coming from these times, which controlled daily life down to a very, very small, minute detail. So now just talk about life in the... Oh, sorry, I didn't realise it was so late. Life in a ringfort. We had farmers lived here in extended family units. So you'd have lived here with not just your own immediate family, probably, but with your greater family, much as, many farms are today. So they were basically pastoral, relying on cattle, sheep, pig, but mostly cattle. But there was also a lot of tillage at this time. There was barley was grown, was one of the most common ones, and oats, and rye to a smaller extent, and wheat as well. But wheat was a much larger, was seen more as a sort of very high status crop, and wouldn't have been grown quite as generally. And around the ringfort, you'd have also had small gardens where they grew things like cabbage, peas, onions, leeks, and beans. So the peas and the beans aren't the ones that we're used to eating now. They would have been much more carbohydrate and used for storage through the winter. Simple hand querns would have been used for grinding. And also you had the much larger horizontal water mills, which would have served a small community. The cows were milked for cheese, butter. You have bog butter from this time. And then, as I said, the sheep and pigs. You had crafts. Every ringfort seems to have carried out its own craft operations. There would have been weaving. So we find loom weights and spindle whorls, all used in the weaving and the spinning of wool, but also flax. So flax was grown and used for making linen. And they would have been dyed with plants such as woad and madder. Woad, which would have given a dark blue colour, and madder, which would have given a bright red. Timber was also a vital resource at this time for building everything, including houses. Of course, at this time you have the first churches being built. And if you imagine in a place like this, it would have been used also for the building of wooden ships. You would have had simple log boats on the lake, on the rivers and the small lakes. And on the open sea, or the larger rivers, you'd have had the currachs, the coracles, which were woven out of hazel and covered in skin, and were safe enough, if you think of Tim Severin and the Brendan voyage, were safe enough to cross the Atlantic. And one unusual thing at this time is there was no pottery being used. So pottery, for some reason, went out of use at the end of the Bronze Age and didn't really come back in this country until the Normans arrived. There were small amounts of pottery found, so we find pottery that had been imported from Europe. So if you think they would have been importing olive oil, probably wine, as Christianity took over, an important part of the Eucharist is to have wine, which of course couldn't be grown here, but would have been imported then from France or from the continent. There is another very sort of rough ware called souterrain ware, but that's found mainly in the northern half of the country. So leather would have been used to make, you would have used leather to make your shoes, a lot of your clothes, your waterproof clothes and hats, sort of basic things like that. But they would have also had a very sort of skillful production of vellum made from calf skin, were used then by the monasteries in the scriptoriums for making such things as the Book of Kells. Bone and horn would have also been used. These were very, very important sort of resources. And when you're excavating ringforts, you'll always find a lot of pins and needles and combs as well. So, I mean, there was a lot of combs with very fine sort of teeth cut out of simple pieces of bone, which are then bolted together. And you had things like dice and other gaming pieces. And then the metalworking. This is an Iron Age community, and it would often appear that every ringfort seemed to have the basic tools there for making their own iron. And iron's a very sort of egalitarian metal in that it can be found in the bogs. It's at the base of most bogs as bog iron, and most people could access it, whereas copper, which had come before, was a lot scarcer and only came from sort of limited sources like Mount Gabriel over Roaring Water Bay here. And the iron would have been forged would have been smelted in bowl furnaces and worked in sort of simple forges using hammers and stone anvils. And these were really important for the tools of everyday life. And I think, as farmers, if you had seen the range of tools they had at that time, you would recognise most things. There would have been ploughs and saws, knives, axes, bill hooks, nails, shearing clippers, pins again. So all things that we would recognise today. And one of the most common finds then you find when you're in the locality of a ringfort or within it are whetstones or hone stones. And these can be with a stone, fine-grained stone, which they chose specially for sharpening the tools, the knives, the scythes. And they can be just ordinary stones sometimes, but you can see they're being polished from frequent use. And in some sites you find very, very elaborate ones where they've actually been shaped, and you'll have a hole drilled through it where it would have probably hung from the waist or around the neck. Copper alloy was also used at this time for more decorative metal objects. You also had glass beads, which are quite a common find on ringfort sites, early medieval sites. You had jewellery, simple bracelets made out of lignite, which is a form of coal. And so they made very, very basic stuff, but then you also have to think of the exquisite metalwork which was happening at this time, with things like the Derryn y Flan, the Adar chalice and the Tara brooch. So features found, you know, that quite often excavation can reveal very little within a ring fort, but those that have been excavated in detail have shown things like a very strong gateway. There'll be large gate posts and sometimes even sort of quite a highly convoluted entranceway into it. And then within the ring fort there would have been quite a number of small huts. And again, this one is unusual in just having the one hut site here, which some of you are sitting on in the middle here. And these were probably built of timber. You find timber post holes in the centre for supporting the roofs. On one site, Deer Parks in County Antrim, they excavated that, and it had been very well preserved by the soil conditions there, and they actually found the huts there were very large, and they were actually figure of 8, so they had 2 circles joined together, and low doorways, only 3 feet high, and the whole thing was actually woven out of hazel basket work, and very, very elaborately and very carefully done, and a double skin, which would have probably been then lined with insulating material or daubed with mud on the outside. And the excavator estimated that for each hut, 5 miles of hazel rod were needed. So that also gives an indication then of how the woodland would have been managed at that time. So coppicing was probably very important, and you've had large areas of the land in either willow or hazel coppice. And the houses were round, as I said. You occasionally get ones like this one, which are a bit rectangular almost. And Ireland's the last country in Europe which actually lived in round houses. So throughout most of prehistory, the round house seems to have been the dominant form. But from the Iron Age onwards, there's a greater movement then towards rectangular houses. There's no clear evidence why that happens, but my thought is maybe as towns or villages grew in importance, especially within the Roman world, then you can't have a round house very easily within a city, within a streetscape. So houses tend to become rectangular, and that just became the norm. And so by the end of the early medieval period, by the time you get into the Viking and the Norman period, everyone then is living again in rectangular houses, as we are today. And then also within the ring fort would have been corrals and stores. So the stores could have been, they think they had little wooden-built granaries as well, but also pits dug into the ground where they could be lined with clay, which could be fired, and then they could be used as storage for other things. And then most ring forts then seem to have an area which was set aside then for craft work. You had the furnaces, the spinning, well, not the spinning and the weaving so much, but the metal working would have been on one side of the ring fort, and quite often actually outside in the ditch or in the area surrounding it. And one other thing you often get near these sites, if not actually within the ring fort, are corn drying kilns, where it was, as it is today, it would have been very hard to actually dry the cereal. So they actually constructed very elaborate, large kilns where you'd have a very slow, gentle fire at one end, and the cereal spread out on mats at the other end, and the heat would have wafted through and just sort of gently dried it. And this could have been used for malting as well, for barley, for beer making. So ring forts go out of use by the 10th century. This appears to be linked with the landscape becoming even more organised, and with the growth of the feudal system, which then became more pronounced with the arrival of the Normans. And settlement became more open and nucleated. Another reason they might have gone out of use is because of the presence of the Vikings. You know, it's from the 9th century that the Vikings appear here, and maybe you felt you were too exposed, maybe living in a ring fort, you know, too obvious. And they've gone out of use at that time, around the 9th century. But as I said, there's definite proof in some places they were lived in until much later and used. And indeed, the Crannog in Tregeela had pottery from the 16th, 17th century found within it, so it was being used at that time. So that is a sort of a rough idea of what we know about ringforts to this day. And normally I would have just ended the talk there, but as the committee's told me, Professor O'Brien, who's the Professor of Archaeology in UCC, came down to visit the site. They asked him down when they had cleared the overgrowth so well here. And he had a look at this and he thinks it's actually not a ringfort at all. So mainly because it's so small, the bank is very, very low. There doesn't seem to be any evidence of an external ditch. So it's a very low bank, very small diameter. And then you just have this one large hut site in the middle, which is sub-rectangular. And he said, and I would agree with him, that it's very similar to this site at near Union Hall called Carragahilly, which was excavated by Professor O'Kelly back in the 70s, I think, when he was looking at the promontory forts in that area, and he was trying to find a date for these. You very rarely find actual evidence of settlement on promontory forts, but he had found this site close to one in Union Hall, and he had excavated it, and it was very similar to this, except it was built out of stone. You had a dry stone enclosing wall of about the same diameter as this, and within that you had a sub-rectangular large structure also built out of stone. And Professor O'Kelly at the time thought they were probably sort of late Iron Age, early medieval, just because it was close to the promontory fort. But recently, I think radiocarbon dates were done on some of the finds that he had from that site, and he dated it back to the Middle Bronze Age, which is around the sort of the second millennium BC, so nearly 2,000 years older than a ringfort would be. So if this, the only way to find out is to excavate. So I hear there's plans for UCC to come back and to do a much more detailed study of the site, to do a proper topographical survey of it. And then they're going to use ground penetrating radar and other geophysical gear to actually look and see if they can see associated features under the ground, see what we actually got here. And then hopefully then they'll be able to do some test excavation and just put a simple trench across here. And hopefully something will be found which can then date this monument. But if it is indeed Middle Bronze Age, I mean, that's a ringfort's nice, but a Middle Bronze Age site is even better. So this could end up being quite an important and unique site in the area. So I wish them all luck with that. And that's the end of the talk. So